Have you ever wished you could just like cut through all the noise and get straight to the core ideas of, like how we understand ourselves and our actions?
It's like information overload out there, right?
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what we're doing here on The Outsider Edge. Just getting right to the heart of things.
No fluff.
No fluff. So today we're continuing our deep dive into Dr. Ravier's general theory of coaching. We're actually on part 10 of 13.
Big project.
It is a big project, but honestly, it's so fascinating.
Absolutely.
We're really trying to unpack all the key ideas in a way that's like accessible and, helps you understand the essence of what he's saying.
Right. Think of it as like an express lane to understanding the foundation of his theory.
I like that, the express lane. And in this session, we're specifically focusing on the groundwork, the foundational ideas, without adding anything extra or changing anything from the text.
Pure Ravier.
Pure Ravier, straight from the source. So we're working directly with his book and really focusing on this idea, the Ante Actio foundation, which, if you're just joining us, that's like the before-action foundation. It's how Dr. Ravier approaches the scientific basis of coaching.
Right, and he lays out a really clear argument for that. It's not just like, oh, this sounds good, let's call it science. It's a very deliberate and structured approach.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the first things that struck me was this concept of methodological dualism.
Yeah.
Can you break that down for us? Why is this such a crucial starting point?
Sure. Methodological dualism, in simple terms, is the idea that studying human beings and their actions is fundamentally different from studying, like, physical phenomena.
So like the natural sciences versus social sciences.
It's not about saying physics is real science and coaching isn't. It's more about saying that we need different tools, different methods, different ways of thinking when we're trying to understand the world of human experience, consciousness, intentions, those subjective experiences.
So it's like using the right tool for the job, right?
Exactly. Like you wouldn't use a hammer to fix a computer, would you?
No, definitely not.
And in the same way, Ravier's saying we can't just take the methods of natural science and plop them onto the study of human behavior and expect to get a complete picture.
Okay, I see. So methodological dualism sets the stage for his whole approach to the scientific foundation of coaching.
Yes, and that foundation is what he calls the eidetic, or sometimes he uses the word apodictic framework.
Right, the Ante Actio foundation.
Exactly. So methodological dualism helps explain why he goes in this direction. It's because he's saying we need a different approach to understand what's going on before the action, those fundamental principles that drive human choice and behavior.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together. And this distinction also ties into how he pushes back against this idea of, like, if you can't measure it, it's not scientific, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He calls this scientism or even panphysicalism. And he actually brings up Carl Rogers, who was a big figure in psychology, to kind of illustrate how this focus on purely empirical methods has kind of limited the field.
Like it boxed it in a way.
Yeah, boxed it in. And it's important to remember that fields like economics, which is where Ravier is coming from, and even psychology in its early days, they actually grew out of what were called the moral sciences.
Moral sciences, huh?
Yeah, which have a different tradition of inquiry, a different way of approaching knowledge. It's not all about just collecting data and running experiments.
So it's more about those underlying principles, the logic behind how people make choices, how societies function.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, he brings in Hayek, the economist. Hayek was very clear that social sciences, in his view, dealt specifically with conscious or reflective human action.
Okay, so not just any action, but action that comes from thought, from deliberation.
Precisely. And this links to the whole idea of Geisteswissenschaften. That's a German term that basically means moral sciences.
I've heard that term before, yeah.
It's about understanding the human spirit, the human mind, the driving forces behind our choices. And Hayek, interestingly, he also did a lot of work on how the mind works. And there's this neuroscientist named Joachim Fusser who actually recognized how insightful Hayek was about the brain. Fusser pointed out that Hayek had this deep understanding of how the brain represents things, not just basic senses, but like attention, intelligence, language, all these higher level functions.
So Hayek was really ahead of his time in a way.
He really was. And this just underscores how complex and nuanced this whole area of social sciences is, and by extension, coaching as well.
Absolutely. Now, there's a table in Ravier's book that I found really helpful for grasping these differences between natural and social sciences. I think it was table 29.
Yeah, table 29 is a great summary.
Can you walk us through some of the key points he highlights there?
Sure. One of the big ones is the difference in what each type of science is studying. Natural sciences focus on physical phenomena, tangible things.
Like rocks, trees, stars.
Exactly. Whereas social sciences are looking at subjective knowledge, people's ideas, beliefs, interpretations, those intangible things.
Okay, so it's like the difference between studying a rock formation versus studying a culture's beliefs.
That's a great analogy. And this difference in what's being studied also leads to differences in how we understand cause and effect. In natural sciences, we often look for direct, efficient causes, one billiard ball hitting another.
A very clear cause and effect relationship.
Right. But in social sciences, we also have to consider final causes. What are the goals, the purposes, the intentions behind human actions? Why did someone do what they did?
And that's a huge part of coaching, right? Understanding the why behind someone's goals and actions.
Absolutely. And then the methods themselves also differ. Natural sciences rely heavily on observation and experimentation, testing hypotheses.
The classic scientific method.
Right. But Ravier argues that for social sciences, a more foundational level is through logic and axioms.
Axioms, those are like self-evident truths, right?
Exactly. So things that you can't really deny without contradicting yourself.
So it's more about building a logical framework rather than just collecting data.
Right, at least at this foundational level. And there's also this idea of looking for general laws versus understanding unique essences and the difference between doing physical experiments versus thought experiments.
Okay, lots of nuances to consider.
Yeah.
And ultimately, this leads to the idea that in this context, social sciences are really about the science of human action, or as Ravier often says, praxeology.
Precisely. And he specifically clarifies that by social sciences, in this context, he means what Mises called the science of human action, or praxeology.
And that really captures the focus on intentional human behavior.
Right. Exactly. It's not just about observing what people do, but understanding the logic and the motivations behind their actions.
Okay, so Ravier has made a very clear distinction between natural and social sciences. And he's pretty adamant about not wanting to just apply those natural science methods to the study of human action.
Oh, absolutely. He's very critical of this idea of just kind of forcing natural science methods onto social sciences, what he calls scientism or panaphysicalism.
Right, like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And he agrees with Mises, who argued that this push for a unified science actually undermines the very foundation of relying on observation and experience.
Kind of becomes a self-defeating argument.
Yeah, it becomes this philosophical stance that doesn't really hold up when you examine it closely. So by making this distinction, Ravier is setting up a different kind of scientific foundation for coaching, this eidetic framework or Ante Actio that we've been talking about.
The before-action framework. And now we're getting into the heart of his approach. So how does he justify placing coaching within this framework? He brings in Aristotle and the idea of the intellect, right?
Right. Ravier delves into some fascinating classical philosophy here. He talks about Aristotle's concept that our intellect can grasp the form of things without needing the physical matter. He uses the analogy of a seal pressed into wax.
Okay, I see. The imprint remains even when the seal is gone.
Exactly. And that's how he illustrates this idea of abstraction, how we can acquire knowledge by understanding those universal principles, those forms or essences.
So it's about getting to the core concept, not just the specific instance.
Precisely. And Aristotle saw logic as the foundation for any rigorous science. He believed that true science has to start with those universal, self-evident principles, those axioms, that are so basic you can't really deny them.
Like the foundations of logic itself.
Exactly. And for him, the most rigorous form of science was the one that logically deduces conclusions from these axioms. He called it first philosophy, or the science of first causes. It's about understanding those ultimate essences.
And then Ravier brings in Husserl, a more modern philosopher, into this conversation.
Yes. He talks about how Husserl was actually kind of disappointed with how philosophy went in his time. Husserl felt that it had kind of drifted away from this pursuit of a really rigorous, apodictic science.
One based on those undeniable truths.
Exactly. But Husserl still recognized the power of systematized logic, like the principles behind geometry, and he believed in what he called pure content of knowledge, those a priori laws that are true regardless of experience.
So those fundamental truths that you don't need to see or touch to know that they're valid.
Exactly. And much like Aristotle, Husserl believed that you could logically deduce theories, conclusions from these fundamental axioms. This creates a self-contained and self-justifying foundation, what he called eidetic science. Or sometimes he used the term ideal science, which he contrasted with real science, the science that's based on observation.
Okay, so this distinction between eidetic and real science, this is where Ravier places coaching.
Exactly. He emphasizes that eidetic or apodictic sciences are fundamentally different from empirical or natural sciences, like psychology, that rely heavily on observation and experimentation. The challenge in eidetic research, he says, is first identifying those rock-solid axioms and then logically building upon them.
So like constructing a building, you need that strong foundation.
Precisely. And his argument is that coaching's primary scientific basis lies in these before-action sciences, the Ante Actio framework.
Okay, so the core theory of coaching, according to Ravier, should be built by starting with these fundamental truths and then logically working out the implications.
Exactly. And this foundation, along with later additions from experience, form the structure of his general theory of coaching. And he argues that choosing this approach isn't just arbitrary. He points to the fact that you see these similar core ideas popping up throughout history.
Across different thinkers, different fields.
Exactly. You see them in Aristotle, you see them in Husserl, you see them in modern philosophers, you see them in education, sports training, even business. And Ravier suggests that these recurring ideas actually form an underlying before-action or eidetic foundation for coaching.
So it's like he's taking these implicit ideas and making them explicit.
That's a great way to put it. And by giving coaching this Ante Actio foundation through logical deduction, he's creating a clear and understandable framework.
And this also explains why he spends so much time looking at the history of these ideas. Right?
Exactly. To make sure that we're not misinterpreting the theoretical basis he's proposing, we have to understand where these ideas come from.
Okay, so it's all about understanding the lineage of these principles.
And this eidetic framework also serves as a kind of internal consistency check for the theory itself.
Ah, interesting. How so?
Ravier argues that this framework inherently provides a way to ensure logical coherence within the proposed theory. Because coherence, he believes, is a universal principle that should guide how we understand the history of ideas, how we build the theory itself, and how we apply coaching in practice.
So it's like a built-in quality control mechanism.
Exactly. It ensures that everything fits together logically.
Now, even though this is the primary foundation, it doesn't mean that real-world experience and observation are irrelevant, right?
And at all. Ravier is very clear that while this Ante Actio framework is the primary foundation, it doesn't prevent us from empirically testing the consequences of these principles and the conclusions we derive from them. It's just that trying to experimentally prove the fundamental framework itself would be kind of absurd. Like trying to do an experiment to prove that 2 + 2 = 4.
Right. Some things are just logically true.
Exactly. The logic stands on its own. Empirical methods, what he calls after action, which we'll get to later, can complement but not disprove the logical deductions of this kind of foundational science.
So you can test how the principles play out in the real world, but the underlying logic is a different kind of truth.
Exactly. Now, moving on to the next piece of the puzzle, Ravier talks about axioms as the bedrock of this Ante Actio foundation. How does he define an axiom in this context?
Yeah, that's a key concept to grasp.
He actually uses the definition from the Royal Spanish Academy, which is that an axiom is a clear and evident proposition that's accepted without needing to be demonstrated.
Okay, so it's self-evident.
Yes. And he specifically says that without demonstration here means without needing empirical or physical proof.
So it's not something you can see or touch to know it's true, but you understand it to be true conceptually.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that clear and evident or self-evident doesn't mean that it's immediately obvious through our senses, but that it's understood through reason. And he brings in Hans Hermann Hoppe, who, drawing on Kant, explained that self-evidence isn't just about feeling certain, but about the impossibility of denying the axiom without contradicting yourself logically.
So it's a truth that's so fundamental that even trying to argue against it ends up proving it.
Exactly. And he highlights that it takes logical and intellectual work to identify these primary facts of reality, as Ayn Rand called them. But once you grasp them, their truth becomes logically undeniable.
So you can't argue yourself out of them.
Right. And he quotes both Hoppe and Rand on this idea of axioms as the foundation for objectivity, for a shared understanding of reality.
Okay, now how does he synthesize all of this to define what an axiom is for his theory?
He sums it up by saying that an axiom is a self-evident proposition that doesn't allow for exceptions, substitutions, changes, or counter-arguments without leading to a logical contradiction.
It's like the bedrock you were talking about. It's unshakable.
Exactly. And then he lists those three fundamental axioms that both Aristotle and Husserl recognized. You have the principle of identity. A is A.
Right. Something is what it is.
Then there's the principle of non-contradiction. A cannot be both A and not A at the same time.
You can't be in two places at once, basically.
And finally, the principle of the excluded middle. Either A or not A. There's no in between.
Okay, so these are like the cornerstones of logic. And Ravier builds his Ante Actio foundation for coaching on top of these.
Exactly. He proposes three fundamental axioms that he believes are the bedrock of the Ante Actio scientific foundation for coaching: consciousness, existence, and action. And he argues that without these axioms, coaching would lack those essential elements that define its nature, its function, its purpose.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear more about these. Let's unpack them one by one. So first, consciousness and existence. How does he establish that those are truly axiomatic?
He starts with Husserl's concept of intentionality, this idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something. You can't have a thought without something being thought about.
So there's always an object to our awareness.
Exactly. And Ayn Rand actually made a similar point, saying that consciousness without any content is a contradiction in terms. And this inherent contradiction in trying to deny consciousness is what shows its axiomatic nature, according to Ravier.
It's like saying, I'm not thinking, which is itself a thought.
Precisely. So he states that the existence of something, the thing we're conscious of, and the existence and function of consciousness itself are primary facts of reality, forming the foundation for coaching theory. He then puts forward the axiom of human consciousness. Human consciousness exists.
It seems so simple, but it's profound when you think about it.
It is. And he argues that trying to deny this leads to a self-contradiction, because the very act of denying it requires a conscious subject, the one doing the denying, and an object of thought, the non-existence of consciousness.
So you can't disprove it without proving it at the same time.
Exactly. And this extends to self-consciousness as well. He argues that the statement, man has the faculty of being aware of his being aware, is also axiomatic.
So we're not just aware, but we're aware that we're aware.
Exactly. Trying to deny this implies self-awareness in the very act of negation. So self-consciousness is a fundamental and irreducible aspect of being human. And then he connects this to the axiomatic nature of existence itself, stating that emptiness or nothingness does not exist.
Because even the concept of nothingness implies some kind of existence.
Precisely. To say that nothingness exists is a contradiction in terms. He goes on to explain that everything that does exist can be called reality, whether internal or external. And this reality is knowable, at least partially, through our consciousness, with which it has an intrinsic relationship.
So it's this constant interplay between our awareness and the world around us.
Yes. And the relationship between our awareness and what we're aware of confirms that reality exists, including our consciousness, and that our consciousness can grasp it, albeit imperfectly.
Okay, so that covers consciousness and existence as axioms. Now, he also brings in this principle of nothing comes from nothing. How does that fit into his framework?
He introduces the Latin phrase ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. And his argument is that since nothing doesn't exist, and the idea of existence arising from non-existence is contradictory, everything that exists must come from something that already existed.
So it's all about transformation, not creation out of thin air.
Exactly. Humans can't create something from absolutely nothing. We produce or create by intellectually connecting or physically combining things that already exist.
So like building a house, you're taking existing materials and shaping them into something new.
That's a great analogy. And he argues that human creation is a result of the interplay between our consciousness, as the driving force, and the rest of reality.
And this leads to the concept of free will in his framework, right?
Yes. So he explains that when we perceive something that exists as being caused, in part or in full, by human action, which itself is driven by our minds, and we can see this connection repeatedly, we arrive at the idea of free will or volition. Acknowledging free will in this context simply means recognizing that each individual human, with their unique mind and body, interacts with reality and can be a cause of certain things coming into existence.
So it's not that we're completely independent of the universe, but that we have agency within it.
Right, and he even quotes Mises on this, who argues that free will doesn't mean independence from the universe, but rather the ability to control our instincts and make choices between different ends. These ideas originate within the universe, but are not solely determined by external factors.
So we're influenced by our environment, but we're not puppets.
Exactly. And Mises says that the ultimate cause of an action lies in the uniqueness of the individual.
Okay, that makes sense. So our consciousness isn't just a passive observer, it's an active force shaping our reality through our intentional actions.
That's the key takeaway. Ravier concludes that human consciousness isn't just a tool for understanding reality, but because it's intentional, it's the driving force behind human beings and their actions. And he argues that the logic of how we act, praxeology, mirrors the structure of logic itself, which gives us a form of certain knowledge.
It's like a fundamental truth about how humans function in the world.
Precisely. Then he summarizes those key conclusions derived from the axioms of consciousness and existence, including that humans have consciousness, can be aware of reality, are self-aware, produced through association or combination. And he adds this idea of free will as an empirically supported postulate, an intentional driving force.
And he also mentions a connection to tacit knowledge that he'll explore later.
Right. He notes that this whole axiom of consciousness is further supported by this idea of tacit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that's hard to put into words. He'll be discussing that more in the next chapter when he talks about the after-action scientific foundation.
Okay, so we've covered consciousness and existence. Let's move on to that third axiom, the axiom of human action. And Ravier takes us on quite a historical journey here.
He does. He actually traces the intellectual lineage of praxeology all the way back to Aristotle. And then through the Stoics, the thinkers on natural law, Aquinas, the School of Salamanca in Spain, and then finally to the Austrian School of Economics.
So this idea of systematically studying human action has been developing for centuries.
Precisely. While the term praxeology didn't appear until 1890, the logic of human action as an eidetic science, Ante Actio, was actually systematized by Mises within economics, although he called it catalactics.
And Mises saw it as having broader implications for all social sciences, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He believed that understanding human action was fundamental to understanding how societies function.
Okay, so what's the core statement about human action in Ravier's framework? What's the axiom itself?
He states the axiom of human action as the human being acts intentionally or deliberately.
Okay, so we have the capacity to act with purpose.
Exactly. And he clarifies that this doesn't mean every single movement is intentional, like a reflex, but that humans have the capacity for intentional action, which we already established with the axiom of consciousness.
Right, so intentionality is a key part of what makes us human.
And he argues that trying to deny this through an intentional action is a self-contradiction. So, for example, even someone who argues that all our actions are predetermined is making that argument intentionally.
It's a paradox, isn't it?
It is. And Ravier explains that many of the categories and principles of human action were actually kind of hinted at in Aristotle's work and have been present throughout his analysis. But now he's explicitly and systematically laying them out as a key part of coaching's fundamental theoretical structure.
So he's building on those historical foundations, but making them more precise and relevant to coaching.
Exactly. And he breaks down several categories that come from this axiom of action. One of the first is that action is teleological.
Meaning it's directed towards a goal or purpose.
Precisely. Because we act intentionally, it means we are beings who have goals, ends, objectives, whatever you want to call them. And to achieve these goals, we have to choose ways to get there. This falls into what he calls the technological category.
So like figuring out the how to achieve the what.
Exactly. And this involves making choices, which links back to our consciousness. And these choices are driven by our motivations, what we prefer, which is the psychological category, and also what we value, the axiological category.
So our actions are driven by a combination of what we want and what we believe is important.
Precisely. And we act because we anticipate being better off afterward. Every choice also means giving something else up, what he calls the economic category. And this involves ideas of utility, cost, benefit, loss, all those factors that we weigh while making decisions.
Right, like a cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly. And then there's the relational category. When we interact or associate with others, it's because we expect to gain something from that interaction.
So mutually beneficial exchange.
Exactly. And when these associations become more permanent based on a common goal, then a natural structure or hierarchy tends to emerge, what he calls the organizational category. Underpinning all of this is the fundamental idea of causality.
Right, the actions have consequences.
And he summarizes all of these in Table 30, outlining the categories of human action and their fundamental theorems. The causal, teleological, technological, psychological, axiological, economic, relational, and organizational.
So he's really created a comprehensive map of human action here.
He has, and from these categories, he derives 8 fundamental theorems about human faculties, like our ability to assume regularity in phenomena, to pursue ends, use means, base decisions on subjective motivations, create a value scale, choose a course of action and renounce alternatives, value utility, cost, benefit, loss, interact and exchange for greater satisfaction, and learn and modify decisions based on our creative potential.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack, but it's fascinating how he connects all of these different aspects of human action.
It is, and this is really the foundation for understanding how humans act, according to Ravier's before-action framework.
And from all of this, he then derives guiding principles specifically for coaching.
Right. He explains that we can actually deduce certain guiding principles for coaching from those categories and axioms. And while some of those principles are themselves axioms or theorems, he presents them as guiding principles for 2 main reasons.
I'm curious about those reasons. What are they?
First, they have been implicitly or explicitly referenced in a similar manner during his historical analysis of coaching approaches. And second, they synthesize those 8 categories, axioms and theorems, into 6 more easily assimilated principles. This facilitates their use in later, more technical chapters.
So it's like he's distilling those complex ideas into something more practical.
Exactly. And he presents these 6 guiding principles of coaching in Table 31, and they are consciousness, freedom, trust, responsibility, commitment, and coherence.
Okay, let's break those down a little bit. What does he mean by each of those principles?
Sure. Consciousness establishes that humans have consciousness and the faculty to be aware, including self-awareness, to learn, to create, to discover new knowledge through their cognitive and creative potential.
Right, so that's building on those axioms we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Freedom establishes that humans possess free will and the volitional faculty, allowing them to choose and decide. Trust establishes that humans face the tension between their desired ends and present reality and the uncertainty this generates.
So we have to trust in ourselves and in the process.
Exactly. Responsibility establishes that humans have the faculty to accept and take charge of the consequences of their free decisions and actions.
So owning our choices.
Commitment establishes that humans are social beings and in their necessary interaction with others possess the faculty to agree and commit, assuming rights and obligations.
So it's about the importance of relationships and agreements.
And finally, coherence establishes that humans have values and a moral duty to strive for the maximum possible coherence with the other 5 principles as they are collidical.
So coherence is like the glue that holds it all together.
Exactly. And Ravier argues that these principles and the axioms and categories they come from are inherent to us as human beings. They've been present in different forms in the thinkers he has discussed, and they've evolved in how they've been applied to helping processes leading to coaching.
So there's both a historical and a theoretical basis for these principles.
Exactly. And that's why he considers them to be the norm or guide for his general theory of coaching.
So all of this is about establishing the continent of coaching, as he calls it.
Precisely. He revisits this distinction between continent and content, which relates to the technical and tacit components of knowledge, to objective and subjective knowledge. And he emphasizes that both are constitutive of the coaching relationship. He makes it clear that this chapter is specifically about laying the groundwork for this continent of coaching.
And these before-action scientific foundations,
Yeah.
the axioms of consciousness, existence, and intentional action, form the basis of this continent.
Exactly. And because they are foundational, eo ipso, he argues that these principles must be accepted, respected, and applied with the utmost diligence and internal coherence in all elements of coaching. Relationships, processes, sessions, tools, methods, everything.
So he's setting some pretty clear boundaries here.
He is, and he's saying that any element of theory or practice that contradicts these principles should be considered improper or inadequate.
So if it goes against human consciousness, freedom, trust, responsibility, commitment, or internal coherence, it's not good coaching.
That's Ravier's argument. However, he also clarifies that the complete construction and theoretical application of this continent will result from the intersection of these Ante Actio foundations and the post-Actio after-action scientific foundations that I'll discuss in the next chapter.
So there's more to come.
Yes, this is just the first part of the foundation. And he's saying that we can't fully judge or evaluate different coaching approaches until we understand both Ante Actio and post Actio and how they relate to each other. And he points out that these deductions from the Ante Actio scientific foundation are also the primary reference for determining what would be considered malpractice in coaching.
Okay, so this is really laying the groundwork for understanding not just what good coaching is, but also what it isn't.
Exactly. So to sum up this session of The Outsider Edge, Dr. Ravier has established this crucial base for understanding coaching by grounding it in those fundamental principles of human action and consciousness, viewed through this lens that recognizes the unique nature of studying human beings, and all built on this foundation of self-evident truths and logical deduction.
Right, so he's not just saying coaching is good, he's giving us a rigorous framework for understanding why and how.
Precisely. And these core principles, consciousness, freedom, trust, responsibility, commitment, coherence, offer a unique perspective on human potential and how we interact with each other. They suggest that by grasping these inherent capacities, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and how we can help others.
And that's ultimately what coaching is all about, right?
Absolutely, helping people tap into their full potential.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration of the Ante Actio foundation. And in our next session of The Outsider Edge, we'll be exploring that post-Actio foundation, building on this initial framework and moving towards a more complete understanding of Dr. Ravier's general theory of coaching.
It's going to be really interesting to see how those two foundations interact.
I agree. And for our listeners, think about how these fundamental truths about our awareness and our agency impact not just coaching, but every aspect of how we live and interact. What new possibilities open up when we truly understand these inherent human capacities? It's something to ponder as we move forward.
Something to ponder indeed.